I had so much fun with him. I asked him if he would come back from the last episode. The author of What's Gotten Into You. It's Dan Levitt. Dan, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
One of the things I wanted to talk to you, and we were just mentioning it before we came on. I mean, have you gotten used to this process of podcast and being on there? Because I've watched some of your podcasts, and I was telling you, you're a pro. You're a pro. Sometimes you have to go, okay, this is what I have to work with today. Have you gotten used to it?
I have by now. I actually really enjoy it. And I especially enjoy the ones where I have an interviewer who's actually read the book and has informed questions like you, which are wonderful. And I also love audience questions, listener questions, because sometimes they're fabulous.
Yeah, when you open it up, I mean, you're always when you go to the audience for questions. I mean, it's always like, well, it's like searching for truffles, I'd imagine, right? That you're going to go through a lot of mishits with the pig before you finally found that truffle that's worth thousands of dollars, and it's always interesting to me. But yeah, I when I watch other people do this, and especially as guests, I find it because it's got to be a conversation. If you're having a conversation, then I think it's worthwhile listening to, right?
Yeah.
But on that, and I've just seen some of this book. And I'm going to and I told you I'm going to go down rabbit holes because I love your background, and I've studied you, and I think if we lived closer, we would be friends because I would just make you be friends with me. I'd be calling you up going, hey, Dan, can we come on, let me come over and have a drink. We're going to talk about this today. All right? This is what we're going to do today. And you'd be like, oh my God, it's Gary again. Oh no. What I love about this, and one of the things I heard you say is, you had a fascination with the history of science. And that's what this book is. If you think you're going to go in and see this mind-bogglingly scientific, this and this and this, which I imagine most scientific papers are because they're written for scientists. You wrote this that I think, I don't care how into the science geekdom you are. This is such an accessible book.
History of science, I love it. I mean, think about this book. This was one of the things that killed me about the book is that we can trace the journey of our atoms in our bodies back 13.8 billion years. So, you learn about the Big Bang and you say, oh yeah, of course. Well, Big Bang, right. But think about it, right? We are made of those particles, right? And we're just collections of those particles. We're collections of 3 times 10 to the 27 electrons and more quarks and gluons. That's all you are, Gary. No offense, but in one sense, that's all you're made of, right?
I've got
and
more
that came
than
out
you
of the
do.
Big Bang. And but yet we can look back and retrace our journey. I mean, how do you look back more than 100 years? How do you look back thousands of years? How do you look back millions of years? How do you look back billions of years? That's insane that we can do it. It's really a testament to our brain, to the mathematical nature of the universe, to the fact that, we are puzzle solving, creatures that, and that satisfaction of puzzle solving drives us forward. And so the journeys of the scientists who always, they went out looking for one thing and they found something completely different, or they said, most of the time the scientific, or many times the scientific breakthroughs don't come with eureka. They come with, oh, that's weird. Right. And so many of these stories were unlikely characters and people who, you wouldn't necessarily predict at all would have been the ones to make these great breakthroughs. So that was a lot of the fun in writing the book was unearthing these stories.
I loved how you would tie these obscure names to history. I mean, really, a lot of these names have lost, and you did 4 years worth of research, right, to make this book, right? So even you
I did. Yep.
You had to deep dive to find these people. So they're not like, it's not like Stephen Hawking, right? And what I loved is how you tied together, like right now, one of the big movies that's out right now is Oppenheimer. And Robert Oppenheimer is in the book as kind of an ancillary character, but he's a he almost a Genesis character, because what he was doing led to these people and these people. Like right off the bat, I'm thinking Martin Kamen, is that him? Martin Kamen and
Kamen,
Kamen and Sam Ruben, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And finding out about these guys and how interesting they were and their lives and the way it went. I mean, Martin Kamen was a very talented violinist and celloist. I mean, not just kind of good.
Yeah.
He was elite in that level.
Well, he used to play with Yehudi Menuhin and among his many friends throughout his life, even though he became a scientist.
Yeah, and seeing his journey and going through it, and his partner Sam Ruben, who had a very different. They both, toward the end of their lives, and Sam Ruben's case was very tragically young. I mean, it got hard. Both of their lives got hard, and I really enjoyed how you taught me that.
Yeah. I mean, their story is so interesting because we understand how the process of photosynthesis works because they created a technique to do that and came up with the solution for how to do it. And the technique involved creating a new radioactive isotope called carbon-14. So Martin Kamen was working at the first cyclotron, one of the to be developed. The cyclotron at CERN, the big atom collider, mm-hmm. which is like a mile in diameter or something like that. Well, the first cyclotron was invented by Martin Kamen's boss, Lawrence. And when Kamen was working on it, the biggest ones were like 3 feet in diameter. That was it. But they were still powerful enough to throw protons at atoms and therefore make new radioactive elements. Hopefully, that's what Ruben and Kamen wanted to do. But, they were in the grungy early days. I mean, Kamen went into chemistry because his dad was unemployed, and he had seen his dad go through really hard times during the Depression. So, and he had wanted to be a violinist or study English, but during the Depression, he realized, maybe that's not such a great idea. So he went into chemistry because they thought, that would be like a safe thing to go into in terms of career. And, they worked so hard to create this carbon-14. We now know it's found naturally, but at the time, Robert Oppenheimer was one of those who told them that carbon-14, through his calculations, could not exist naturally. So This was at Berkeley. This was at Lawrence Livermore, right? This was at the Berkeley Radiation Lab before, of course, the atom bomb, although not long before it, right? Because they actually went on to work on the Manhattan Project as well, at least Kamen did. But so they, it was only because of a rivalry between their boss and another very famous scientist, Harold Urey, that they were finally given the resources to do it, and they threw everything at it. When again, other people told them it was a fool's errand, and ultimately, Ruben created carbon-14. But then here's another example, right? So they had carbon-14. They had the world's only supply, and they were going to use it to solve the problem of photosynthesis, to understand for the first time chemically how it works, because almost nothing was known about it. Literally very, very, very little. And so here they had the world's only supply, a monopoly. They were going to do it. They were going to, win their Nobel Prize, mm-hmm. right? But then tragedy struck. The war came. And all of a sudden, all those people working on colliders at Berkeley were moved over to work on the Manhattan Project. And Kamen was actually friends with Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer was a bit of a fellow traveler. That is, he had a lot of socialist friends. Kamen hung out with him. He had divorced his wife, so he started hanging out with new people. So he hung out with Oppenheimer and a lot of other very progressive people. And so he was trailed by the FBI and by the Army intelligence because they were afraid they thought Oppenheimer was a security risk. And they were afraid that Kamen, who had a he liked to talk. He was a big talker. That in these informal gatherings that he would reveal too much. And so ultimately there's a tragic story where he was invited to meet a Russian attaché. He went for dinner. He was actually trailed by intelligence agents from both agencies there who kind of like bumped into each other at the door. Right? Yeah. It was a bit of a funny show. But once he met with the Russian attaché, because the attaché wanted to ask him about obtaining a radioisotope to help somebody medically, he was fired and blacklisted and couldn't get a job. So he was banned from Berkeley, banned from the Manhattan Project, blackballed. He was ultimately accused by McCarthy of being a communist. And there was a long time when he fought to clear his name. So he was unable to continue that research. At the same time, Ruben, who was his longstanding collaborator, who was a biologist, Ruben during World War II was working on poison gas, which you might think is weird, right? We didn't use poison gas during the war, but the U.S. Army was wondering whether to clear those beachheads in Europe, which they knew they were going to have to do, whether they could actually use poison gas to do them before the soldiers came in. And I mean, think of D-Day and all those beaches where there were so many casualties. So they had Ruben supervise tests. And, poor Ruben, he was working really, really hard night and day. And, he was driving back one day after he had been, had gotten almost no sleep for a couple days, and he crashed and hurt his arm. The next morning, he was so intent on doing his work that he walked into his office and he began pouring some poison gas into a container, and it cracked. He ran outside with his assistants. They warned other people and they lay down on the grass, and his assistants lived, but he died.
Oh, isn't that amazing?
So here were these two guys who, were completely derailed in their scientific efforts, tragically, both of them, because of the war. And so their inspiration and the carbon-14 that they developed was then used by other scientists at Berkeley right after the war. As soon as the war stopped, it was handed over to them. And so Melvin, Calvin and Benson ended up being the ones instead to solve many of the problems of many of the chemical reactions that are responsible for photosynthesis. And it was Calvin who won the Nobel Prize rather than Kamen and Ruben.
Did they mention they stood on their shoulders where they thanked them? Did they get any kind of recognition at all, just even in the acceptance speeches? Do you know?
I don't know. I'm not sure that they did. Calvin liked to keep, he was brilliant scientist, but he liked to keep a lot of the credit for himself. So, but I don't know for sure.
Wow. And it might have been dicey, with Kamen and his reputation at the time, right? To bring that up.
Yeah, you're right. That's right. Although it was in the early 60s, so a little bit later, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, because it's that, and even though we can look back on history and go, wow, you get why they were afraid of their leading scientists. I mean, you get that of divulging these secrets and stuff like that, and the concept. And it's just a shame. Then you got nut jobs like McCarthy who go crazy and try to use it to hoist power from common elected officials, and from there.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I mean, it's true. Kamen was as loyal as they come, and there was no way. On the other hand, there was the Verona, Klaus Fuchs, I think his name is, and others who were in the Manhattan Project who did give the Soviets, a lot of critical information.
Yeah, the Manhattan Project, because it's in the news, because the movie right now. I mean, you tell some great stories of people scientists who, after that, and kind of realized what they had done as far as their own moral code. right, who walked away from doing any war research whatsoever, that led to great discoveries for the rest of us.
It did. And actually, Harold Urey, who worked on the Manhattan Project as well, and it was his rivalry with Lawrence who led to the resources that became into Robin, to Kamen and Ruben. There's a linkage there, right? But Urey was one of those who also was a physicist, worked on, I don't remember what it was. It might have been uranium separation, or maybe it was the creation of some isotopes that were necessary to create for the bomb. I don't recall. But he walked away, and instead he decided he was going to study geology. He was going to study ancient geology of the solar system. So he was one of those who really pioneered the study of ancient meteorites and asteroids. But along the way, I mean, this is fun. One of his graduate students was this guy named Stanley Miller. I don't know if you remember from high school, but there was in the 1950s, 1953, Stanley Miller took ammonia gas and carbon dioxide and water vapor and added a spark and created on his desktop equipment, right? Mm-hmm. He created amino acids. And those are, of course, the important biological materials that we are made of. Only he created two or actually more than that of the ones that our bodies are made of. And so Miller, really pioneered the experimental study of the origin of life. And this was Harold Urey's graduate student. And so, if it hadn't been for Urey, it might have been a while until somebody else came up with that idea.
Well, that's a fun story too, because he zapped it with electricity, right? He kept adding that, trying to recreate the primordial sludge, if you will, of all the elements being in existence on the Earth, and then being hit by the lightning storms and everything. Right. Because again, with the temperature inversions and stuff, the Earth was racked with storms for a time. You talk about it in the book of unimaginable, just rain, storms, lightning that we can't comprehend as a weather system today.
Yeah, that's right. At the time, no one had any idea how life could have evolved, and no one thought that you could even study it. And Miller was the one who, he heard a lecture by Urey, and he thought, well, gee, why don't we just see what happens if in our laboratory we try to recreate the conditions of the ancient Earth, which are completely different from what the Earth is like today. The atmosphere was completely different, and there was huge numbers of volcanoes and lightning and all kinds of cosmic rays and so on. And Urey said, there's no way this is going to work. It's way too risky. You're going to spend years on this and you're going to get nowhere. I mean, what are the chances that if you're on your desktop, right, you're going to try to recreate the conditions of early Earth, and you're going to make organic molecules that we're made of just like that? But Miller, said, well, if you're not going to let me do it, I'm going to go find somebody else to work with on another problem. And so Urey relented and said, well, okay, I'll give you a year. And after that, you're going to have to go back to the drawing board and find another problem. Within 3 months, Miller had created organic molecules. It was that fast. And by the way, Carl Sagan was one of the people who he gave a tour of his lab to before he actually did it. And this really was one of the things that kickstarted Carl Sagan's interest in the possibility that life exists elsewhere, because he had seen that Miller actually was able, just through these simple experiments, to create some of the complex molecules that we're made of. It really completely kickstarted a new way of thinking about the origin of life.
Well, and it leads, and again, you have to read the book, because there's stories that go from that, where people say, okay, well, you could create this, but it doesn't have everything it would take to push it into the cellular form. Yeah. And that's when the heat vents at the bottom of the ocean starts getting involved. And it's a fascinating where you're like, oh, well, that's what, and then somebody else comes along and goes, hey, but it's not exactly the way, and you would need all of this stuff. And thank goodness for those people throughout history, the history of mankind. mankind, because the majority of us don't think that way. The majority of us think, what's for lunch? Can I get out of the sun? Right? I mean, that's the way the majority of us think. And that's just, that's the human pack animal. But the fact that somebody sits back and goes, why do those dots in the sky move? Or how did we get here? And that's something that that's where the mythological stories came from. And every culture has mythology, because there was somebody trying to come up with a reason to figure out how and why we're here. Mainly why we're here, but part of it was how we're here. And then when science came along, to some extent, I guess the true scientific methods, and again, remember, you can correct me. It does not hurt my feelings. This is what you do, right?
Okay.
If you want to talk about Garth Brooks or Tim McGraw, I'm your boy. But
okay.
when it gets into here, I say these things, and I never want you to go, hey, moron, you're wrong, or fear doing that. I want you to be able to go, and you misread it. I'm totally good with that. But now, okay, I've lost my train of thought as far as
I'll just pick up and say, so one of the things which is incredible that scientists have been able to do, is reconstruct how we got here from the Big Bang, from this crazy, just random explosion of these tiny subatomic particles and energy packets. It doesn't necessarily explain why we're here, right? Because, who knows what went before. But it certainly does explain why we're here. And it's incredible, just incredible that we can do that.
Oh, I remember what I was saying. I was going to say that science, as we can recognize it, probably started in the 1500s as far as what we recognize as science. So that's what I was going to throw out and say. Does that kind of jive with you, or would you put it earlier or later?
It depends upon how you define science. I mean, I think there were, there were early Greeks who you think might be proto-scientists, and then there were many Arab scientists who inherited the mantle from the Greeks. But yeah, the people who we generally consider the first modern scientists came all around in the 1600s. Like, I talk about one of them who was the first his name was Gilbert. I don't remember his first name at the moment. And he was one of the first to, investigate magnetism. And he ended up, because he was using a magnetic rock and using essentially a compass around it, he ended up theorizing that the Earth itself, might have magnetism in it as well, and today we know it's because of the Earth's magnetic core. But interesting little tidbit, it was his book and his work that was one of the things that inspired Galileo to do his experiments in physics and really become, the defining early scientist, because Galileo was the one who said, well, all that talk is nice, but, let's actually test things and see what we learn from the evidence, as opposed to just speculating about what seems logical. And that was the scientific revolution.
I just sat back as I was saying that. And after I said it, my own brain said, boy, you're an idiot. You ever heard of a guy named Archimedes? Would you consider him a scientist?
Yeah,
well, yes,
absolutely.
Yes, I would. Yeah. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been around even longer. And the Archimedes story is crazy. I mean, not that just as far as you know about the Archimedes, it's like this guy was so far beyond his time. Yeah. And they finally found his diary that had been written over in a monastery. And they were like, wow, if we'd have had this, who knows where humanity would have been,
Yeah. Yeah. He was absolutely brilliant. Absolutely.
Just a concept that the theoreticals, because I know you taught physics. You taught physics in Kenya. That's amazing. Mm-hmm. What is it about physics that because I would have to assume there has to be a passion for it, especially there has to be a passion for teaching, but teaching physics can't be easy.
Well, I'll be very honest with you. I was teaching high school physics using the British, curriculum, the same one that they use because Kenya was a British colony.
Yeah.
So it wasn't rocket science. It was basic physics, I wasn't teaching relativity. I was teaching, mechanics and basic physics. And that's not unbelievably difficult to understand or to master.
You say that.
Unlike theoretical physics, that's a completely different story.
Well, you say that with modesty, and I respect that. But nobody's going to come up to me and say, "Hey, Gary, you want to teach this high school physics class?" Yeah, I'm not going to do anybody any good. I'm just throwing that out there. It's going to be horrible for me and worse for the kids. Let's just not. And theoretical physics, and maybe that's it. And that's what Archimedes may have been the first. Well, I can't say that in my mind. The first example of somebody who did go into that theoretical stage. And you could throw Leonardo da Vinci in there. Okay, I'm fine with that. But the whole theoretical stage, it's amazing how Stephen Hawking, these guys who can just...
There are people who have those minds. Absolutely, right? Yeah, absolutely. It is amazing. On the other hand, one of the interesting things that I found when I was writing my book, because I traced so many different kinds of discoveries, is, a lot of discoveries were brilliant insights like Einstein and relativity and Lemaître and the Big Bang. But so many were also, oh, what's this?
Mm-hmm.
Like, when you're talking about the origin of life, and Stanley Miller thought that the amino acids and the other essential organic molecules that we're made of first arose on the Earth's surface because there were these gases and there were lightning or hot springs or something, and they kind of came together and fell into a warm body of water and then began to assemble life. And then these geologists, this was in, I think, 1977, these geologists went off of took a research ship to close to the Galapagos Islands, and they took the submersible Alvin, right, which is the Woods Hole thing that can go down to the bottom of the ocean. They were looking for evidence that there were hot springs at the bottom of the ocean because no one had ever seen them, and this was going to give them more evidence that this controversial theory of continental drift actually might be true. So this party of, some 30-some geologists and technicians were out there. These guys, 3 of them went down to the bottom of the ocean. And Corliss, who was the lead in the submersible, radioed up to his assistant and said, "Hey, the bottom of the ocean, isn't it supposed to be a desert?" And his assistant said, "Yes." And he said, "But there's all this life out here." And they had discovered a hydrothermal vent. And at that vent, they discovered the most bizarre life. They discovered these weird colored plumy worms and these funny colored crabs and all kinds of really weird stuff. Very vibrant ecosystem that was a mile down in the ocean, completely shut off from sunlight or any other source of energy as far as they could see. So, these guys, they scrambled to take all these, they went down again and again, and they scrambled to take all of these samples back. They radioed Woods Hole and said, "What are these things?" And the Woods Hole biologist said, "We have no idea." And they didn't even have anything to bring them home with except Tupperware, right? They had plastic wrap. They had a little bit of formaldehyde and some vodka that they'd bought in Panama on their way, right? They were geologists. Yeah. They had no idea. So, right. So all of a sudden, with the discovery of life at the bottom of these ocean, at these hydrothermal vents, that created a whole new possibility for how life could have arisen. And so now there are 2 competing schools. Did life arise on the Earth's surface, or did it first arise at the bottom of the ocean by hydrothermal vents? But, this wasn't some theoretical, maybe life's down there, but this was some geologists who were completely unprepared, happened to stumble on it and made one of the greatest discoveries in 20th century biology.
That segs us into what we're going to talk to next, which is life. I'm going to take a quick break. I'll be right back.
I am thrilled to welcome Beck Shoes to Here's What We Know. And I know Beck Shoes, all of the Bay Area does. They continue to grow. Find out for yourself with the Beck Shoes difference. When you visit, it'll be an experience that frankly you're not used to. You won't have to find a shoe yourself, or at best have someone find a size and that's the last you see of them. Beck Shoes will accurately measure your feet. Then they will 3D scan your feet. You heard me, 3D scan. And then they will make sure your shoes are custom fit just for your feet. And you'll have over 75 brands and thousands of styles to choose from. Work boots, dress shoes, casual wear, sports gear. It's at Beck Shoes waiting for you. To find a location, just visit beckshoes.com. Whether for work or play, they have your feet covered at Beck Shoes. If you're looking for Western wear, you need to find Winchester Western Wear at 1185 South Bascom Avenue in San Jose. You're not going to find the perfect outfit at the mall or the outlets. Come to the place with over 40 years of experience and all the top name brands like Ariat, Justin, Stetson, Tony Lama, and more. When you go to the great country shows at Shoreline, SAP, Club Rodeo, or Clola Shans, you'll be looking your best. From boots to hats to everything in between, with a knowledgeable staff that'll make the entire experience a fun one. Find them online at winchesterww.com. That's winchesterww.com. Or put this in your maps, 1185 South Bascom Avenue in San Jose. Winchester Western Wear. They'll help you find a look you love.
Dan Levitt, what's gotten into you? Dan Levitt, the author of What's Gotten Into You, The Story of Your Molecules and Atoms. I'll tell you a dad joke I gave my son. Maybe you've heard it. I said, I never trust
Okay.
atoms. And he goes, why? I said, because they make up everything.
I like it. I'm going to tell it to my kids. They're going to love it.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
It's good. It's good.
Welcome. Feel free. When it comes to life, as you said, you broached it as we were just talking about, they found this life where it's not only the fact that there's no sunshine, it's the pressure. The idea that you could exist in the pressure of the ocean. If you dive down to the bottom of your pool, you feel it. You feel it on the pool and your head, and there's only so far you can go, and just the weight of the water as it's being compresses you. The idea that a mile or 2 miles down, that life can exist.
A mile. Yeah.
Was a mile? Because I have no idea.
I don't think any oceans are 2 miles, but
I don't know. How deep is the
down.
Mariana Trench? Was it a mile and a half?
Maybe. It's not 2 miles. I know that.
Listen,
anyway,
as I told you, I'm just throwing things out there. But the fact that it could be a mile down, and that something could exist just through the pressure, that life adapted to create a thing that, and I would think that'd be a problem trying to bring those things up because they're used to that pressure, and who knows what's going to happen when it comes up. But you have the theory that it on the surface or the deep, and as we touched on, and we just spent a lot of time on our last episode, the theory of Mars, right? That the theory that it was brought on one of those asteroids or comets that used to bombard the Earth, that maybe it hitched a ride on that. I mean,
bacteria might have. That's right. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
As far as that, and then because in the book, I love how you deftly handle that. This is life, right? Now, the molecules and everything that creates us, and what creates an Archimedes, that's a different topic.
Yeah.
And I enjoy that, because when it comes to life and life on other places, life on other planets, I would think, and I think it would be scientifically relevant. And I saw where they did this. I talked about it on my radio show one time, because they had released this thing about they used a supercomputer and put everything in and try to figure out how many planets there would be within our galaxy that could sustain intelligent life. And the answer was one. And we're standing on it, right? As far as what it looks like. And it's interesting when it comes to what's your take on life in other places? And what do you think? I mean, I would think that the most likely thing we'd find is microbial life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I talk about this in the book because here's how life evolved on Earth. That is our ancient ancestors, right? There were single-celled organisms, no oxygen in the atmosphere. Cyanobacteria, which were bacteria, began to figure out how to take carbon dioxide and oxygen from, carbon dioxide and hydrogen from water, and using energy from the sun, create sugar molecules. That's essentially photosynthesis, and that's how the organic molecules, those are the raw materials that the organic molecules and thus are largely made from. That as a waste product started to liberate oxygen into the atmosphere. So you had, for billions of years, all you had was single-celled organisms. You and I need a lot of energy, a lot more energy than bacteria in order to function. The only reason we're able to do that is because we have these very sophisticated cells with energy factories in them that bacteria don't have, and they're called mitochondria. Like your typical cell has 2,000 mitochondria in it, right? So if you laid out all the mitochondria in your body, it would cover 2 basketball fields, and your body generates about 100 watts, like a 100-watt light bulb, right? That's because mitochondria are efficient in taking sugars, combining it with, and breaking it down, and releasing the energy. That single-cell organisms don't have, or at least, bacteria don't have those mitochondria. So, there are scientists who think that oxygen that photosynthesis put into the atmosphere, and remember, it's 21% now, right? You use a lot of oxygen all the time. That may be unique in being able to liberate enough energy for active, intelligent creatures to exist. So if that's the case, then if there are active and intelligent beings somewhere else in some other planet, or that it may be that planet has also essentially been terraformed by life. That is, photosynthesis also evolved there that introduced oxygen to an atmosphere that no longer had one. And so that greatly decreases the probability that we're going to find intelligent life in places. Because what are the chances that we're going to have photosynthesis and mitochondria, these little factories that actually use oxygen to liberate energy so efficiently? It's certainly possible. And given the numbers game, it's, I probably think that it's likely, but it's a lot less. And certainly within our solar system, it's unlikely that we're going to find more than bacteria. Having said that, which is what that's where my suspicion, there are other scientists who will say there could be other weird organic, combinations of molecules that we can't even conceive of that could create life in some other way. So, certainly no one can say for sure, but I think it does lessen the odds that any particular place is going to have, intelligent life.
I find it fascinating. And again, I know it's a bit off topic, but it's still within the realm of what we're talking, just because I want to get your take on it. Not that you're an expert or anything. What do you take on these? Like when the Pentagon releases these pictures of these, they don't call them UFOs anymore, UEPs, unexplained phenomenon, what you as just Dan Levitt, just a guy who sees it.
I don't think there's anything at all to it. I just saw something on Twitter the other day. Someone said, since I was a kid in 1956, I've heard the Pentagon has this, the Pentagon has this, the Pentagon has this. And, there's no real evidence. It's a fun thing to think about, but, it's all in the realm of conjecture. And if there was real evidence, there would have been a whistleblower who would have brought it out, and it would have been in scientific journals, and scientists would have been all over it, and they would have said, yes, this is real. But This is all just, there's so many other reasons why people think about these things now. I'm not saying that it's impossible for aliens to arrive here. I think it's possible. Nobody can rule it out, but I don't think that we've seen it so far based on the evidence that has been produced up to now.
Here's my take. And I've said this before. We as humans can't grasp the size of the solar system, much less the galaxy. We can't grasp the idea of how far another galaxy is.
Yeah.
You can hear light years all day long, but until you truly can sink your brain into 186,000 miles a second.
Absolutely.
Which is just beyond, it really is. I mean, maybe Einstein, maybe these guys really true, but I mean, it's beyond our scope to know how far things away. And I would think that if you came here from that distance, it wouldn't be a plane-size object, right? That you would, just the food that you would need to bring, as we've learned from our own travels, right? The supplies that you would need to be, there would be, I would think, a some sort of craft about the size of the moon that would have to come out, and I think they would go, "Hey, y'all, we're here, and I just want you to know." But the concept of how far things are out, we don't.
Yeah.
We talk about Mars now. Mars is incredibly far away, and it's so much closer than Jupiter is. And Jupiter is 1 billion miles from Saturn. Think of that, 1 billion miles, and that's just and that's not the end. There's still 2 more planets and what do they call it? Planetoid now, and a planetoid to go. That's just the scope of what we can say is our neighborhood. And then the next solar system away is, again, light years.
I agree with you completely. I mean, I actually think that it's very likely that there are intelligent beings out there somewhere, but I don't think it's likely that they can bridge the distance to come to us. Now, there are a lot of scientists that spend a lot of time thinking about this, and there are many people who think that if there are aliens here, they're not actually flesh and blood, but they've sent some kind of probes, right? That don't have to eat food, right? Some kind of mechanical, sentries that have come out to do the exploring for them. And, to my mind, that would be much more likely that they would actually send some poor organic being who had to suffer. Can you imagine suffering through light years of there's nothing out here, right? Oh my God, until finally you get to some place that looks hospitable. God knows what looks hospitable to those poor creatures who are in that spaceship.
Well, I mean, and you've kind of covered that, right? I mean, you did one of your documentaries was a search for its alien life, wasn't it? I mean, so I kind of brought that up because you do have a bit of an expertise on it, just as far as watching what the scientists who are truly searching for that, what they're going through and how they're doing it. I find it fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And there scientists think that it's certainly possible. Many scientists think that intelligent life is out there. And you can't say that it's physically impossible for some civilization to come visit us. But, this is where people differ. My own suspicion is it's really, really unlikely. And certainly, we haven't seen the evidence for it yet.
Now, my take is I think intelligent life is exceedingly rare, simply because when you go through, as you will in your book, the possibly billions of things that had to happen just to get you and me right here, right now. Just from the distance of the moon, the creation of the moon, the distance from the moon away from the earth, the tilt of our axis, as you said, all the little things that created, and just the right set of circumstances, and then to survive the chaos of a creation of a solar system. As you and I talked about last time, there was they theorized 100 planets at some point was in our planetoids, I should say, was in there. And those things had to happen, all the right things, all the right places. And at one point, I think the theory was that Jupiter was close to the sun. And then Saturn came along and pulled Jupiter out, because I know in most of the solar systems we found, it's very common for the gas giants to be close to the sun. You know, and I just, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, another very interesting, unlikely event was, I mentioned the fact that we need mitochondria in our cells in order to create enough energy in order to run around and talk and do all the things that we do. Mitochondria were created in a one-time event. Now, that's the story of the wonderful Lynn Margulis. I don't remember if we talked about her before.
Carl Sagan's ex-wife.
Right. His ex-wife. That's right. And, that seems to have been literally a one-time event where a bacteria that could extract energy from sugars more efficiently was engulfed by another single-celled organism. And instead of being eaten up, it eventually evolved into mitochondria. It doesn't seem to have happened more than once.
See, that's what I'm saying.
It's another unlikely, right?
It's mind-boggling how many things, the more you study, and that's the thing, that's the beauty of the history of science and the joy of science. The more things you study, the more answers you get, opens up a new multitude of questions. You don't get one question. You get 200, 6,000, 7 million. That's the fascinating joy, frustration, everything.
Yeah, that's what makes it fun. Absolutely.
I just think it's just such and the thing I like about the book, like I said, how many scientists, as we touched on earlier, were looking to make money because they lived through the Depression or their fathers and stuff. That was a common thing. It was either somebody was trying to make money or some rich guy who had, who was a king's favorite and had all the money and he could just do experiments and see what happens, and we talked about before, the people who weren't.
But I would say they weren't looking to make money. They weren't looking to get rich, or they wouldn't have gone into science.
Yeah.
But they were, these were, in particular, some of these chemists during the Depression, their fathers were laid off, right? And those were hard times. So they wanted a stable income, right? Some job in which they wouldn't be laid off, essentially.
and from what I've and again, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not stable. You're constantly looking for funding. You're constantly looking for the project, right?
Yeah. Today, of course. Today it's a challenge being a scientist. Absolutely. It's quite a wheel that you're running on in order to get funding. Absolutely. It's a wonderful thing to do. Absolutely fascinating, very fulfilling. But it's work. It's hard work.
Yeah, and I know some of the people, and we mentioned and you've worked with different high-profile scientists. I know last time we mentioned Sean Carroll and Mashio, what's his name? Michio
Kaku.
Michio Kaku. I'm sorry. These are the rock stars. These aren't the guys out there. The rest of them scrambling. When you have a pretty good, but even those guys they had to kind of create something out of nothing. It's like, hey, I've got this idea. Let's go down this path and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because, you have to also come up with new ideas and then defend it when people say you're nuts, right? That's a large part of the scientific process is, coming up with a idea. And if you find the evidence and you believe in it, you're going to have a lot of skeptics because scientists are trained to be skeptical. And that's why science works, because people are constantly saying, well, yeah, that sounds nice, but couldn't it be this, or couldn't it be this, or couldn't it be that?
Yeah.
Right. And so you've got to, hold the line and try to convince people. And there's so many stories in my book, as I think we talked about before, where, people came up with things that, we consider great, tremendous breakthroughs, But at the time, they were completely written off as, until eventually they brought the evidence that turned people around.
Well, you even discussed the biases that scientists have to fight, right? That and you, there's a number of them. I think there's 3, 4, maybe 5.
In my book, I almost every time it seemed that somebody came up with a great discovery, people in their colleagues at the time, and these are big breakthroughs, would say, no, I don't think so. And so, when I finished the book, I was like, why is this? This seems nuts. So I went back and I started to try to analyze the different cases to understand it. And so in my book, there were 6 cognitive biases that came up. There was the too weird to be true bias, right? That was the example of the Big Bang, or the, as an expert, I've completely lost sight of how much is still unknown. I don't remember if we talked about that, but one of the examples is, people thought that organic molecules couldn't exist in space because cosmic rays would just destroy them, but they hadn't thought about the fact that big clouds of organic molecules could exist. And so, the molecules on the outside could protect the ones on the inside, right? There's the, you look for and see the evidence that matches your existing theory, which prevented people from discovering vitamins for hundreds of years. Or if it seems, most likely, to be true, then it is true. There's the wonderful story of Albert Claude, who was a biologist around the 1920s, who didn't believe what almost everybody else believed, that inside the cell you had a nucleus, you had something called mitochondria, no one knew what it was or what it did. And all the rest of the cytoplasm was just enzymes. Those are those molecules that insanely accelerate chemical reactions in a cell that would take 1 million years to happen. Instead, with enzymes, that can happen in many times a second. So the theory was that there were just a whole lot of enzymes that were churning things around, and that's what basically created the life in your cells. And the reason why they thought that was because when they looked through the microscope, they couldn't see anything other than this kind of like gray, dense, speckled stuff. Microscopes were the maximum resolving power. And, so they couldn't see anything more. They couldn't really see what was there, but they were sure that it had to just be enzymes. It couldn't be anything else. Mm-hmm. Right. And, so this guy, Albert Claude, was sure that there had to be something else. And what he did was he ended up using a centrifuge to grind up cells and then centrifuge them at super fast speed and separate them, and then take that material and centrifuge it again. And he found that there were little dots and things were segregating according to weight. People thought he was nuts because they thought, what, you've taken cells, you've ground them up with a mortar and pestle and put them in the centrifuge, and then you think there's anything that, could remain intact? You've destroyed everything. You can't have found anything meaningful. But then Claude, was the first one to pioneer the use of an electron microscope, because in the early 1940s during the war, there was only one electron microscope in New York City, and he got the chance to use it. So he was the first one, along with one of his colleagues, to use an electron microscope to look inside a cell. And lo and behold, once you could see, all of a sudden they discovered all kinds of things in the cells. There were mitochondria and all kinds of other organelles. And, now we know there are all kinds of microtubule roads, and there are all kinds of tiny nanomachines. And, and these are like real machines with interlinked parts that are churning and whirring and doing all kinds of changes in their shape and configuration and moving molecules around. That's how we know so much about how our body works today and the causes of so many diseases. Because, by the way, every single one of those organelles and machines, if something goes wrong, that's the cause of another disease, many of which we know about, right?
Yeah.
But in 1927, when Albert Claude came onto the scene, people knew nothing about that. And they were sure that it was just enzymes. And that was it, right? Because that was all they could see.
Wow. I and the idea and the as you talked about, we don't in the early 1900s they could not, and probably the 1920s, 30s, 40s, they could not contemplate the creation of the scientific instruments that was coming. Right. So they had no concept. Just as
Right.
today we go into it with the idea of, oh, well, imagine what we're going to know 20 years from now. Right. Because we now know we don't have the grasp. We've heard of a quantum computer, but, I don't have enough brain power to know what a quantum computer can do, but I know it'll
Yeah.
be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so many scientific discoveries came about not because it was brilliant intellectual brainstorm, but because there were more powerful microscopes, or there was carbon-14, or there was the cyclotron, which made it possible to create, new particles. And it's the cyclotron that allows us to understand particle physics, which allowed us to go deep in the atom and find the subatomic particles and allow us to understand what was created in the Big Bang. That was Lawrence at Berkeley in the 1930s who came up with that instrument. So, there's no question that, as our instruments get more powerful, we're going to learn all kinds of things that we had no idea about. And, the flip side of that is one of the real frustrations that scientists have, let's say psychologists, neurobiologists who are studying the brain, or even cell biologists, is that we're still so limited in the tools that we can use, right? Like the brain, 100 million neurons, each one, has like 10,000 connections to other neurons, right? And there's no way that we can, and we're still limited to tracking large groups of them, or just a single one, as opposed to many different groups. So our tools are still very limited, but with new tools, those will bring great breakthroughs.
And there's still so much. I mean, as you state in the book, we know how you're made, but we don't know why you're you. And it's just so poetic. Maybe one day they will, but and then when you get on the other side, my youngest son, he loves him some comic books, and he's got a little bit of a scientific mind, and he was talking about because somebody, Ant-Man or something in quantum physics and stuff like that. And he goes, "Can you explain quantum physics to me?" And I'm like, let me give you an overshot of what I know. We have laws in the physical universe, the big universe, that are pretty solid. When you get to the quantum level, none of those laws apply. That's what I can tell you as an overview. Right?
That's good. That's absolutely good. That's very good.
It's like, and we don't, the more I read on it, it's like, well, yeah, we don't know. It could be this and it could be that. And
there
stuff.
are a lot of mysteries.
And I told him
Absolutely.
The thing about, hey, we're made up of atoms, and you may think you're touching something, but you're not. It's the atoms, going with, interacting with the molecules of what you're interacting with, but you're not actually touching it on the quantum level. And he's like, what? And I'm like, I know. All right, Dad's class is over. That's it. I got nothing for you. You want to know about Tim McGraw, Garth Brooks? That's what I can do.
That's great.
As always, I enjoy our conversation. And like I said, you're just lucky you live so far away from me, because I'd be over at your house all the time. You'd be like, oh, I care. Because all the stuff, because all the documentaries you've done, I'd go down I want to talk about the dinosaurs. What do you think they'd be like if they were still here? What kind of evolution process would have worked on that? That would have been just brilliant. You've done the Custer's Last Day and the Archaeological. You've done so many interesting things. It must be fun to just sit around and talk to you about, Dan, what you working on?
Well, this has been a lot of fun, and I would love to come back sometime. Let's talk about some more things. I love it.
I will. I'll go down. You know me, Dan. I'll go down the rabbit hole with you. So I've got my big checklist of things I can talk to you, because I can talk with you to some, not that, I'm not besmirching my friends. It's just, let's just say this. Maybe I need smarter friends, Dan. I mean, just maybe I need smarter friends. I mean,
well, I don't know. It's smart. It's, I've had
they hang out with me. So how smart can they be? I'm just saying, Dan. Dan Levitt, thank you as always. Such a pleasure.
All right. Well, thanks. This has really been great. Thank you.